And welcome to On the Line Perspectives on Partition, a series of conversations organised by the Bloody Sunday Trust. I'm Paul McFadden, and throughout this series, people from across the community have agreed to reflect on one of the truly seismic events in modern Irish history, the partition of the island 100 years ago this year. All of us on this island, to a greater or lesser extent, and I would say to a greater extent, have been affected by partition. Many of us have very strong views about it, some in favour of it, some very much opposed to it. For today's guest, partition has been something which to a large extent has overshadowed, surrounded, enveloped his entire political career, and it was a lengthy political career. He's the former Sinn Fein national chairperson, Mitchel McLaughlin. Mitchel, thanks very much indeed for joining us, first of all. I've known you for, actually, I was just thinking before this interview, for 2/3 of my adult life. We've had many conversations over that time. And the issue of partition has kind of always been there, if not right up front, very much in the background. So it's a big feature of both our lives. I suggest you, we're offering everybody in this series an opportunity to kind of give an opening statement or monologue or however you wish to describe it. So I'll extend that same courtesy to you because it has been a big feature in your life anyhow, and certainly in your political life.
Yeah, and monologues aren't a new experience to me. I've often thought I was talking to myself, but
myself alone.
exactly. I mean, you referenced partition, and clearly this is a very historic centenary year of the partition of Ireland, and people will have positive and negative perspectives and all of that. My sense of it, I mean, what has formed my political career was an absolute commitment to the idea that the people of Ireland were perfectly capable of managing their own affairs, and we didn't need any interference from Britain. And neither have I ever been convinced that Britain had acted in anybody's interest but their own in terms of their dominance of Irish politics and Irish social and economic affairs for a very, very long time. And this is an issue that I think, I would like to engage with those, I describe them as of the British tradition, and I pay respect to their commitment to their British identity and culture and ethos. However, the people of Ireland, in my view, remain absolutely sovereign, and their right to make decisions about their future has never, in my view, been diminished, despite the policies of various governments and international developments over the past century. So I see an opportunity, and may I say a positive opportunity, because I do believe that we're on the cusp of another truly significant era in the history of this country, which is a discussion about an independent Ireland, an independent future, one that is founded on the politics and the authority of the people of Ireland, all of them. And that conversation is going to happen, and that process of constitutional change is going to happen. And there really is no point in people ducking their responsibility and passing that along the line to the next generation. We have seen the consequences of that in the past number of years. So positive engagement, respectful remembrance and commemoration, and respectful conversation about an agreed future.
I'm all for respectful conversation, obviously, Mitchel. It's in fairness, it's a process, I think, isn't it, that you would have in the past, a younger Mitchel McLaughlin would have expected to have seen completed by now. I think you would have imagined decades ago that Ireland would have been united by now. Has the resolve of the people of the British tradition, their obduracy, surprised you at all?
No, I don't think that. I don't think that that's where I would lay the responsibility. As a Republican, I went through, as I gained more experience, I had a particular role on behalf of Sinn Fein in the gestation and development of our peace proposals and the various documents that we produced in the late 80s and early 90s, and the engagement with the Irish government and the the Unionist community as well through back channels.
You're understating your role there almost, I'd say. I mean, you were a key figure in all of that kind of strategic development was going on within Sinn Fein and in engagement with the Unionist tradition? I mean, you were a big figure in that process.
Well, I was in the leadership of the party from the. I was a member of the National Hits Block Committee during the hunger strike, and I took up full-time politics at that time, and I was on the national executive, the Ard Collier of Sinn Fein, for 25 years from that period forward. So I was involved in all those kind of developments, but it was a collective leadership, and I just have to mention people like Jerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, Jerry Kelly, to give you a sense of the Brian Keenan, the stature of the people that were there. And I mean, we were working across a range of projects, which included developing and deepening the strength and the organizational capacity of the party, whilst at the same time convincing very skeptical opinion, particularly in the media, that Republicans were actually interested in peace. The portrayal of us, during all the Thatcher years, and I'm sure you can remember that you were only a cub reporter in those days, but you can remember that, the portrayal of Republicans is that we were, warmongers, bloodthirsty, subhumans almost. You can remember all the kind of the repression, all the kind of the deployment of repressive kind of policies, such as collusion with loyalist paramilitaries. I think quite often a lot of those loyalist paramilitaries, and there's an echo in this in my belief, that we could have had an earlier conversation with unionism had the British government's policy on Ireland genuinely been one of no strategic or selfish interest. But even now, even though they signed in the Good Friday Agreement that very statement, I mean, they're watching what's going to happen in Scotland whenever we're discussing with them what should happen in Ireland. And they clearly have a very selfish strategic interest. So they're blocking what could happen, which must happen, which is a productive and fruitful conversation and peaceful conversation about an agreed future with those of the Unionist stroke British tradition in Ireland. It's going to happen anyway. It's a question of who's delaying it. It's a question of who is promoting it. And my view is that the British government are still guilty, even though, like they've indicated on more than one occasion lately, that they've no regard for the Unionist community over Brexit, for example. But in my view, we still have to convince a British government either to, promote the idea of dialogue and agreement on Ireland, join the persuaders, in other words, or else make it clear that when they say they've no selfish or strategic interests in Ireland, that they actually start to practice what they're saying.
I mean, that's a phrase memorably used by Peter Brook, I think, for the first time. Has what's happened in Scotland?
Did that at our encouragement.
Yeah,
we were discussing that through channels at that stage.
Yeah.
And it was a clear indication that within the British establishment, and he was one, there were people who were of a much more positive and confident sense of what Britain should do if as a world power. And he got agreement at the highest level, including from Thatcher, for that statement. So it was an indication just of the extent to which the message was finally sinking in that Republicans were prepared to engage in discussion about peaceful outcomes.
But would I be right in thinking that it might be one thing for a Tory grandee like Peter Brook to countenance, the breaking away of Northern Ireland from the Union, but Scotland is of a different order altogether? I mean, has what's happened in Scotland or what is happening in Scotland, muddied the picture here, do you think?
Oh, I think it certainly does. But the Scottish people, no less than the Irish people, are entitled to determine their own future. There is a difference in the two histories, insofar as there was always an element of negotiation. Some people from a Scottish nationalist perspective would describe it as betrayal, but it wasn't an issue of. What we had was a unionist tradition that was planted in Ireland, and we might come to kind of discuss the politics of the census that's starting to emerge now when people are talking about demographics. But the British government had introduced a question on religion in the what was then a British census that was conducted all over the island of Ireland, which, you know, so they're asking the question about religion 140 years before they introduced it in Scotland, Wales, or England. 140 years in advance. So they were using the politics of the census. And indeed, the 1911 census, when the Unionists realized that they only had a 56% majority in the province of Ulster, they did a recalculation based on studying the 1911 British census, enumerating the religion of the people who had responded to the census, and come to the conclusion that they were going to cut off, you know, Cavan Monaghan and Donegal, and that, you know, the loyal brethren, the people who had signed, who had been on the Kersen Trail and who had signed the covenant, were told, "I'm sorry, but you're on the wrong side of this equation." So they came up with a calculation that gave them a 66% majority rather than a 56% majority, which is a much less tenable proposition for partition. But in all of that, the British government were conniving and were cooperating and were assisting, including assisting in the establishment of the Ulster Volunteer Force.
When you think back, even that majority, you know, delivered as a result of the Boundary Commission, I think, of 1925, and that fixed line being entered into, I think, with the League of Nations in 26. Even that majority, that contrived majority, has evaporated now since, I mean, the last assembly election here. We saw the Unionist majority in the north disappearing for the first time in history. How has that changed the dynamic, do you think?
Well, I think it has changed the dynamic, yeah, because the Unionist community, even back in those heady days of 1921, I mean, the first thing that they did after the Act was passed was expel Catholic workers from the shipyard and from the Sirocco rope works in Belfast. And, you know, you had the pogroms in Belfast, and you had the, you know, what became known as what your granny might have described as the riots in Derry, or the riots was the word they used. You know, 25 people killed in a week. So, I mean, all those kind of things demonstrated that the Unionists never really had sufficient confidence in the arrangement, at least not to be able to kind of deal with their neighbours on an equal basis. So, you know, the UVF were incorporated practically wholesale into the specials and the RUC, you know, so that they formed the backbone, if you like, of policing the nationalist community. And that was their relationship right up to events such as the civil rights struggle and the attack on Duke Street and the Battle of the Bogside, when the army were sent in to kind of relieve them when they were, you know, they were exhausted and had failed to overcome or to subdue what was a community in revolt at that stage. So those kind of issues, going right back to the formation, indicated that there was a very, very deep vein of insecurity and mistrust, maybe of the British government as well, within Unionism, because they behaved, you know, quite outrageously against their, you know, what was their fellow country people, albeit of a different political tradition and religious tradition. But now the demographics have tilted the balance, and they may well have a fear, and this is why I want to engage in dialogue with them, that they're going to be treated in the way they treated the nationalist community over the years.
How receptive the Unionist population is to that? And I make the point, you use the phrase Unionist population as opposed to the Unionist political body, or the Unionist body politic, to that kind of conversation. From your experience, I mean, you've had contact with people, many people in the Unionist community. Are they up for that?
Well,
kind of engagement that you'd like to see?
Going right back to the beginnings, the origins of the peace process. So I'm going back to the very early 1980s period forward. There has always been, in this city and in Belfast and elsewhere, there have always been people from the British tradition or the Unionist tradition who were prepared to engage and prepared to talk and prepared to kind of, you know, perhaps help us understand how the engagement with unionism could be successfully carried forward. But there was also a very real difficulty, because we're talking here about very genuine and principled people who did provide invaluable advice and insights, but they found it, and this kind of compounded the difficulty facing Republicans and nationalists. I mean, John Hume included, had difficulty overcoming this resistance to a dialogue about what can we do to make things right, what has to be done to make things more equal for everybody. These people that we were talking to were facing very real hostility if they divulged, which we never would do, if they divulged that they had been engaged in conversations with mainstream Republicans and couldn't take it any further. And in effect, they almost became, against their own will, gatekeepers. We were talking to them, but they couldn't take the conversation any further or deeper into their own community. But that has started to change as well in recent times. And if you look at the example, and it's a great example of David Latimer in Derry, and then take other examples such as the agreements and the compacts that have been developed over the marches, and I mean, an apprentice boys march was the, if you like, it's what lit the fuse in 1969. The background being the brutality of the RUC, the fact that, Sammy Devaney had been beaten to death, that poor man McCluskey in Dungiven, at the hands of the RUC again. So the scene was set, and there was nobody able to step forward. I mean, O'Neill, who was, I think, genuinely trying to modernise the Unionist government, but I mean, his vision in those kind of middle 1960s, early period just before he had to resign, and the turn of the decade. He said, if you give Catholics a job and you give them a decent house, they'll behave like good Protestants. That's where he was starting from. And, this was a modernizer. So you could have despaired at that, but anyway, I don't despair that easily. But I think we're getting to the point now where the conversation is now irresistible. It can be delayed, certainly, but it can't be stopped. And I do think that, Unionists have to find a voice, and a confident voice, and they have to be saying, this is what we expect in the context of constitutional change. So there can be no question of people being dominated or suppressed or discriminated in the way in which, a whole generation had gone back to the 1920s, right up until the civil rights era, at which point nationalists began to kind of stand up on their high heels and say, look, that's the end of it.
Intrigues me about the fact that you have, if I use it in these crude terms, you have the orange and the green, those traditions, and you have people on the green side who are urging a move to a united Ireland without ever, really sort of being in favour of what exists in Dublin at present, and you have the people on the orange side of the equation who want to remain part of the union, but at the moment feel that they're possibly about to be sold out by people at Westminster. So they're neither of the two of them make very convincing advocates for what they're selling.
Well, I think that the motivation for engagement really has to be the future. That is the generation that's starting to emerge. Are they, going to be allowed, because of drift or because people are refusing to enter into a dialogue that will lead to negotiation, hopefully leading to an agreement? Because if there is that kind of neglect, and that's what it would be a dereliction of duty, then you could actually sentence another new generation to conflict. I often describe the Good Friday Agreement, and it was a massive, massive achievement. But we ended the war, but we didn't end the conflict. And I do think, that conflict that goes on, you can hear it in the stridency of contributions on the media. You can see it in the demonstrations. You can see the little things that blow up into big things, big rows and near riots. You can see it in the slippage there when, the PSNA at times slipped back to behaving as if they were in the RUC. All those negative kind of influences are, making people cautious. I understand that. But when they would, start to look around at their children and their grandchildren, I would say they should just kind of straighten their backs and say, right, we've got to talk. And I think that goes for people from a unionist background every bit as much as Republicans and Nationalists.
Could I just clarify? Talk about the fear that the possibility that you might sentence another generation to conflict. Do you foresee any possibility of return of violence in the kind of scale that would have been commonplace 25, 30 years ago?
Well, I mean, nobody has a crystal ball, but I actually quite deliberately make the distinction when I say about the Good Friday Agreement. We ended the war, but we didn't end the conflict. The conflict is about the future. That can be a disagreement in, in conversational terms, or in debate or discussion, or in negotiation. I mean, the trade unions are in constant conflict with the bosses, they would tell you. Yeah. But nobody's reaching for, bombs or guns, and neither should they. This kind of issue, there would be no point, in my view, in any Republican whatsoever advocating armed struggle. And you can see that, those kind of dissident groups, as they've been known, and I'm sure amongst them are people who are very, very committed to what they think is the right approach. You can see that, the broad nationalist and Republican community have just kind of said, that's a nonsense. There is absolutely no excuse nor reason or logic in that activity. So consequently, like they're shriveling on the vine, in my view, and that's a good thing. What they should do is be part of the conversation and the argument and the rationale, rather than become an excuse for people to continue to say, well, we're not talking to them. Republicans are playing both, they're talking out of both sides of their mouth. Republicans, in the main, have made it clear over and over and over again. And, the advances that have been made by Sinn Fein, for example, I mean, I'm very proud of them. They're going to be a government party in Dublin. It could well be the biggest party in the north and the biggest party in the south at the same time. Does anybody doubt that Sinn Fein is going to use that power in a productive and peaceful way to achieve an end to constitutional conflict on this island? It's too small an island, and we're too small a population to allow this to just drift on and on and on.
You would want to see, sure, Mitchell, a border poll happening fairly early. It's provided for, obviously, within the Good Friday Agreement and all of that. And yet it's one of those things, I mean, when I think back to the flags dispute in Belfast, I could conceive of an issue like a border poll, even though it is a democratic exercise and all of that. But as an issue, it could be, one could quite easily see it becoming, a catalyst for conflict in this community. So are you worried about at all about the possibility of destabilization occurring when a border poll is triggered, or when it becomes likely?
Well, I mean, let's just be clear that I think a British government should make a decision that there's going to be a border poll.
But you mean commit to one now, like within a...
No, listen, no. See, I'm going to answer your question, or at least what I think is the implication of it. If they were to announce there's going to be a border poll next year, then I think we'd have conflict that escalates into warfare. What they should be doing is announcing a reasonable time span to allow for negotiation and agreement to emerge. If I'm a unionist who's fearful of the future, who doesn't trust my government, which is the British government, who doesn't think that the present kind of leaderships of all the political parties will magically produce overnight an agreement, who's fearful of the idea of a united Ireland, then they're not going to sit down, or they're not going to be pressurizing the political leadership to sit down and talk as a means of delaying the inevitable. So the British government have to, they really have to lance that boil by saying, and I'm not setting a date, but it should be within, say, 5 years, and say 5 years to agree what kind of united Ireland or agreed Ireland you would be voting for or voting against in this border referendum, which is going to be held. Set the date, give enough time for the parties to shake their heads, to do the research, to prepare their arguments, but to engage on the task of an agreed constitutional structure for an all-Ireland government. And that could be everything from, you know, a united Ireland. You know, it's quite a small island, and that's my favourite decision. I do think, you know, regional governments can be interpreted as, you know, as a, if you like, a sop to those who say, but the North is different. The North is only different because of the British government's role. It becomes the same as every other part of Ireland when the British genuinely disengage on an agreed basis, you know, and it'll include fiscal matters and financial reparations and transfer of assets and so on and so on and so forth back to the people who matter on this island, which is the people of Ireland. They have to have total control of that on an agreed basis. And it's a peaceful perspective. It's a peaceful scenario where you negotiate that out, you agree it, you sign it off, you lodge it so that nobody can deny what was agreed. And people going to the polls on a border poll know exactly what it is they're saying yes or no to.
Do you think there have been appetite in the Republic to have United Ireland?
Well, I mean, I think that not everybody will vote for United Ireland, but yes, I do think that. And I think that on the basis of both the strength of Sinn Fein in the south, you know, despite quite heavy lobbying and punditry within the media, which is quite hostile, but it still doesn't hold back the national sentiment. And when they are consulted, you know, the parties, including even Fine Gael, are very careful to, you know, to reaffirm their commitment to the national goal, but they're not doing very much about it up to now. But I think they're coming under more and more pressure to actually put their money where their mouths are.
And could you ever see a majority of people from what you called at the outset, the British tradition here, could feel comfortable in the kind of United Ireland that you would like to see occurring on this island? I mean, I think like your name, for example, you're named after a Presbyterian minister, isn't that right?
Yes, that's right. Well, the son of a Presbyterian minister.
That's right. There you are. Thanks for the clarification and the correction. But you know, how do you persuade? They used to talk about the 1 million Unionists in the North. I don't think we can say it, be sure that now that there are 1 million Unionists in the North.
No, and there never was either, by the way. But here's the point. The Unionists themselves have proven that there is a positive answer to your question. Because when they said to the Unionists of Donegal, Cavan and Monaghan, I'm sorry, but you're staying on the other side of the border. You know, we can't afford to bring those three counties along with us. And those people did prosper. They did survive. And they actually created, with partition, by the way, with the Protestant state for a Protestant people, kind of, you know, slogans that were being used in the North. You know, they did create the proof of home rule being Rome rule, you know, in the south for far too many years. But look at the changes there. You know, Ireland in the south now is a modern European society and starting to kind of represent more and more of that liberal tradition. So, you know, the fear that you know, people of the Unionist tradition in Ireland would be mistreated is, I think, just based on fear. It's not based on sitting in a room and negotiating out the type of protections. For instance, Sinn Fein is committed in writing and by policy, passed at our Ardèche a number of years ago, to a written constitution and a written Bill of Rights. You know, so that everybody has exactly the same protection under the law. And these are the kind of, these aren't gestures to the Unionist tradition. That's the kind of country we want to live in, the kind of society that we want to live in. You know, where there is no sectional interest and there is no preference and there is no discrimination. So I think that, you know, we can have that argument out. We could refine it by virtue of the contribution and the input from people who have a different tradition. But when the Unionists abandoned their own kith and kin, in many instances, when you would go and talk to those people, and obviously Sinn Fein have talked to people from that tradition, and some of them have joined the mainstream political parties in the south and vote for those parties. You know, they've demonstrated that you know, there is a life after ending partition, because they're the proof of it and their successive generations.
Well, look, thanks. Always, always enjoyable to converse with you and to engage with you in something as meaningful as this. We've had many a conversation down through the years. I hope to God that people do lift and run with this idea, because this series is all about exploring something which is of critical importance to all the people, I think, on this island. And
yeah, it's a brilliant initiative. I'm very pleased about the fact that the Bloody Sunday Trust took it on.
yeah,
And you know, I hope it has an influence in terms of other debates that I'm quite certain are going to emerge in the coming months.
yeah, respectful dialogue, Mitchell. You mentioned at the outset.
Yes,
We're all
yes,
for respectful dialogue.
exactly.
Thanks very much indeed, Mitchell, for joining
Right,
us.
well, good to talk to you again.
And putting your views on the line.
Thank you.